As you'll notice here in IntelliJ in the background, the process method can throw an exception. So in this video, we're going to take a look at what exception throwing looks like in Pulsar functions and how that can lead you to want to set up the dead letter Q and retries. I'm going to artificially throw an exception if the message contains a certain value. And I'm going to just get that into my function via a new user config. So I'm going to say exception string is going to be a new user config. And we'll say anytime that the message contains the words message to, let's throw an exception. But of course, you could be doing all sorts of connections to other databases, etc., and those could end up throwing exceptions. So here in IntelliJ, let me add that in. So the first thing I'm going to do here is copy this line and say, let's look for an exception string in our user config, and locally I'm going to call that exception string. And then we're going to get that off of the context object just as we had done before. And then we're just going to do something super simple here. I'm going to copy this if statement. And say if my exception string is present, and if it's of type class of string, and if my message contains message to, let's go ahead and throw a new exception. And I'll say throwing exception for message. And then I'll take the input. So that's the string that was the input. Next, I'm going to remake my jar file. So maven clean install. And then I'm going to run the pulsar_ctl functions update command, which in this case would update both the changes to the access user config with SDK YAML file, in addition to the updated jar file. So let me go ahead and execute that. And then here back in IntelliJ, I'm going to start my consumer, start my log consumer, which we configured in a previous step, and then I'm going to produce 10 messages. So here on the left, we can see that we have produced messages 0 through 9. Message 1 is passed through to the output topic based on the previous video where we allowed this message through. Many messages are rejected due to that code down here in this if-else statement that we configured previously. But the message that contains message 2, this one here, is going to be throwing this exception, which means this process method never returns. So what ends up happening to message 2? Message 2 ends up being continuously redelivered based on the default processing guarantees that we have of at least once delivery. But since it's never returning null, we never actually acknowledge that message. So here in the logs, we'll see various entries related to encountered exception, and it'll say potentially which message. I'm not sure if it says it here, but if we head on over to the UI, we can actually see the exceptions that are being thrown from our application. So here in the UI, I'm on my function tenant function namespace. I've clicked on the Functions tab. If I go to the Access User Config Functions and go to the Exceptions tab, you'll see that it's throwing exceptions based on that text that we had put in our application. So it says throwing exception for message my message to. Now I've only published this message once, so we're going to essentially end up getting this message repeating here forever. And there's no way for this message to clear out because we're throwing the exception. The process method never actually returns and allows us to acknowledge the message. One way might be to make some changes to our processing guarantees, also allowing us to manually acknowledge the message, which we're not going to get in this video. But instead, what we're going to do is show you that you can use dead letter queues in your functions, just like you would with your regular Java client, for instance. So after the message attempts to deliver multiple times, never getting ACKed correctly by the function, we'll essentially then throw it over into a dead letter queue. So we're going to add 2 entries into our YAML file to help us configure the dead letter queue and the maximum number of retries. So max retries is 1. So if the message fails to either or if the function fails to either send a message or return null, the process method for our function, we're going to try one more time. And if that one also fails, then we're going to send it over to, and I'm going to fix this here and say function tenant and function namespace. Then we're going to send the message over to the output topic DLQ. And I'm going to create another consumer that consumes from this output topic DLQ. So before I do that, let's head on over to terminal. And I'm going to run pulsar functions update again. And the function should now be updated to use the max retries and the dead letter queue. So we'll create a new class called SN DLQ consumer. And I'm going to copy the log consumer exactly. We'll go ahead and paste this in. All I need to do is change the name here. And then I'm going to change the topic that this is reading from to our dead letter queue topic. Let me go ahead and start up my consumer. I'll start up my log consumer. I'll start up my dead letter queue consumer. And then I'll rearrange these so that we can see all 3 of them at once. Now, if you're following along, you might actually see message 2 already show up in the dead letter queue consumer because the message 2 that was stuck constantly going through an exception previously might now actually get processed correctly through 2 exceptions and into the dead letter queue. So you might actually see it there. I've been making a few changes as I maybe make a few mistakes and have to make some edits. So mine already has been cleared out. But what I'm going to do here is show in the producer what happens when I produce 10 new messages, what happens to message 1 and message 2. So we produce 10 messages. Message 1 makes it to the output topic. Message 0 and then 3 through 9 all get rejected, and we then write a log message because that's what we've configured. But that message 2 hits an exception. Now it's not going to send to the dead letter queue yet because we have max retry set to 1. So we have to wait for the message to be resent into the function, it to throw an exception again, which means no acknowledgement is received, and looks like it just encountered another exception. So we should see it show up over in our dead letter queue consumer in just a second since it's now been rejected twice. And we now see the message over in our dead letter queue.